So I'm sure that many of you will have experienced having private security guards attempt to stop you from taking photos in the spaces, which is ironic because very often you're being filmed by the same security personnel. And it's interesting that images have such power. You know, what is the fear behind someone taking a photo? What do they think you're going to do with that photo? We were really baffled by the arrests because we hadn't done anything criminal. But it seemed that the concern over the photographs that we had taken, these photographs of what we considered public space, right? These are spaces that are built and maintained with taxpayer money. We wanted to see these spaces. We wanted to share them with people. What this public-private partnership that is Transport for London was concerned about seemed to be a sort of a future threat that might manifest because we had taken these photos, and they couldn't quite articulate what that was. But there's an assumption that stopping us from taking the photos, in their eyes, possibly prevented that future threat from manifesting. But this seems to confuse the issue, because if I go to the website for Transport for London and I search for hire photography location, it turns out that I can pay £600 an hour to take photographs of an abandoned station, as long as I've got £5 million in liability insurance. So it would seem that photography of hidden space is fine, as long as we're willing to pay for the privilege. It would seem perhaps that maybe people with money aren't a threat, or maybe even that even national security has a price. So you're going to think that I'm totally paranoid at this point. And I'm going to prove to you that I am by showing you this PDF that was put together by the National Counterterrorism Center in the United States, where they've cited my website at the top left corner there, and they've implied that the photography that we're taking is potentially going to aid terrorists in gaining access to these spaces. And I have to wonder, if I had paid for the privilege to take those photos, would I still be aiding terrorists? So you'll get now that it wasn't exploring these places that got us arrested, or even photographing them. It was doing what I'm doing right now. It was sharing information that got us arrested. Because in doing that, I opened out a discussion about urban space that made visible the boundaries that are being circumscribed around us all the time. And, you know, these boundaries that are being rolled out by private corporations are being rolled out in cities all over the world. You know, CCTV systems have this amazing ability to actually stop us from doing things even if they don't work, right? This is the dark secret of CCTV. If we think we're being watched, we'll regulate our own behavior. The cameras don't even have to work. And you can see that when we sneak into the tube, for instance, and we run past dozens of cameras, there's actually no response. There's no one there, right? So it seemed to me that these corporations were treating us as photographers of hidden spaces in the same way that they would treat computer hackers that leaked classified documents, right? So I came up with this notion of place hacking, which is sort of the subtitle of my book, Place Hacking the City, because it seemed to me that there was a synchronicity here between us and computer hackers, right? These are closed systems, whether we're talking about closed virtual spaces or closed physical spaces. And if you can find the loophole in those spaces and get behind them and kind of get to the source code, you can start to rewrite that code. And that, I guess, is what they fear. So my passport was taken, I guess, to trap me, but more than that, my passport was taken to silence me. It was to put the fear into us to stop exploring. But of course we didn't. I think that information should be shared. I think that transparency is important in a democracy. I want to know what's being built in my city, by whom, with what funds, and to what ends. And I think these are all perfectly reasonable expectations, just as is the expectation that people are going to explore the environments they live in. I don't want to live in a city where people have stopped exploring. That's not a city that I would find interesting, and I hope that many of you would agree with me. When we explore cities, when we ignore those no trespassing signs and cross those borders, whether we can see them or not, we open up opportunities for critical creativity. You know, as Mark said in the film, we make the impossible possible. But we also recreate these places in our image. And I think that's really important. You know, if we're going to live in cities where we are citizens, we've got to interact with places. We have to recreate places in our image. So you remember in 2008, we were staring at these chimneys and we were frustrated that we couldn't get any closer. Well, in 2014, long after the arrest, we returned to the chimneys with some ropes and we climbed to the top. So this experience was like, I mean, I can't ever describe to you what this feels like to be standing on the top of the chimneys at Battersea Power Station, you know, with the clouds floating by, watching the sort of lights twinkle in the city. It was an absolutely incredible experience. And of course, it's an experience that I couldn't have been given. I had to take it. And it taught me that, you know, space, and especially urban space, I think, you know, can always be reimagined if we continue trespassing. And we don't have to go somewhere else. We don't actually have to leave the island, you know, that's become our prison. We can reimagine those spaces again and again. And I think that the experiences we've had and the stories that we've been able to share about an inspiring world where adventure can still happen despite all of these changes in security and surveillance, you know, that's the story that I really want to tell. But I guess more importantly, I want people to be able to look back on this period of time. You know, perhaps in the future we won't be able to explore like this, right? And I want people to look back on this period of time and you know, and see this book and think, we were still trying, you know, we pushed back. Adventure must be pursued despite the consequences. So I found this, this little piece of graffiti on a walk a few weeks ago, and it really stuck with me because I remembered that first night in the Battersea control rooms and the terror that I felt because we had just hopped a fence, right? And I realized that, you know, here I was 5 years later, and not only did I not feel that fear anymore, but I was doing things like, you know, standing here talking that I would never imagine I would have done in 2008. Exploring had changed me. It made me realize how important it is not just to confront challenges, but actually to seek them out. So I'm not going to ask any of you to become an urban explorer. I think it's not something that most people want to do. What I am going to do, however, is to ask you to think more about what you don't see and about the visible and invisible barriers that are being built around us, barriers that are changing the way we behave. And I want to ask you to think about trespassing those boundaries in whatever small ways you're willing to do, and to discuss more openly whether those boundaries and barriers are ethical, legal, or justified. And I want to ask you to think about whether trespass might just be essential to democracy. Thanks very much.